You can defeat every single fight in Final Fantasy XIV. Rubicon the Extreme, AAC Light Heavyweight, UCOB, Fru, all of it. You can beat him if you want. In this video, I'm going to talk about some tips that can help you become a more confident raider in Final Fantasy XIV, where you can start tackling and overcoming the game's hardest challenges. This video is targeted towards players who already have some raiding experience under their belt, but newer players might also find these tips helpful. You probably have no idea who I am, so before getting into any of the tips in the video, I'm going to first introduce myself a little bit. My in-game name is Jalapeno Jeff. If you see me in-game, I'm this guy. I've been raiding since Shadowbringers, around the time when Eden's Promise was the current raid tier. Since then, I've accumulated a lot of raiding experience at all levels, clearing Savage and Ultimate fights on content whenever they were released. I'm also part of the Ulti project, where we have spent the past couple of years helping thousands of players with their first time Ultimate clear. I was also part of a prog squad for 1 year, where we help players prog ultimates, not just clear. All this is to say, I'm not pretending to be the best player in the game, because I'm not. But I have a lot of experience with players of all different skill levels and different backgrounds. Through these experiences, I learned how to best help people with their worries and doubts when it comes to the hardest Final Fantasy XIV raid content. I'd like to share with you 4 tips on how you can best improve as a raider so that you too can enjoy the feeling of accomplishment and satisfaction when you finally defeat some of the hardest Final Fantasy XIV raids. There are many qualities you can look at which would make somebody a good raider. For example, are you a good raider if you're able to output high amounts of damage and consistently parse high? Are you a good raider if you bring good vibes into a static? Or are you a good raider if you're able to defeat every fight in the game and can rely on that experience for future fights? There are a lot of important qualities to consider, but this video will focus on what I think is one of the most important qualities of a good raider, and that is mechanical consistency. If you're able to turn yourself into a raider that prioritizes executing mechanics and minimizing the amount of wipes you cause your party, all the other qualities such as damage and level-headedness will come naturally, I promise. That being said, let's get into the tips that will help you become a more mechanically consistent raider. Starting with tip number 1, stop completely relying on your memory. Every player, including myself, has the experience of studying a mechanic, feeling confident that everything makes sense, only to get to the mechanic in game and then your brain shuts down. You draw a blank. You forget everything. And what's worse, Savage and Ultimate fights can span anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes in length, and they're full of all different types of mechanics and different rules. Your memory is bound to fail you at some point. I'd recommend, instead of spending all of your time making note cards or diagrams so that you can memorize everything, try to restructure how you think about mechanics. I'll explain through 2 examples. First, let's talk about the Gilded Araya. This isn't even a Savage or Ultimate fight. This is just a regular fight you can get from the Trial Roulette, so it's not even advertised as something particularly difficult. But, for the sake of example, there's a very good mechanic to look at here. Let me play a clip of the mechanic and see if you can follow it. For experienced raiders, this mechanic is nothing crazy, and you probably never get hit by it. But for a newer raider, this can be a little overwhelming. The boss is cleaving in a bunch of different directions, there are limit cut numbers. Do I have to memorize the order to not get hit? Well, instead of trying to memorize the cleave order, what if I told you there's a little trick? The boss will never cleave the backside, and they will never cleave the same side twice. So, all you have to do is stand behind the boss where it's safe first, and then dodge into the cleaves. Let's play a clip where this mechanic appears again later into the fight, and see if you can follow it now. At this moment, once I find the first safe spot, I don't even care about the rest of the telegraphs. I'm not paying attention to the limit cut numbers of the cleaves anymore. I'm just going to follow my personal rule that I gave myself. To demonstrate this, I'm actually going to cut out the rest of the telegraphs and just jump straight into the mechanic. Hopefully, this simple example showed you why sometimes it's easier just to find a pattern in the mechanic and then assign personal rules to yourself that you can follow instead of trying to memorize everything. But with that being said, let's get into a more advanced example. This is the unending coil of Bahamut, or UCOB, but we're going to focus in on the nail phase. This is a very chaotic phase with a lot of stuff going on, but I want to just focus on a few things. I'll show you a popular raid plan that people use to study and learn nail. This raid plan has all the information you need to understand everything about the phase. All the mechanics are explained, and things are showed step by step. There are a lot of steps because there's a lot of things going on, and it's very tempting for somebody new to raiding to go sequentially through the steps and try to memorize everything so that they feel prepared before attempting the nail phase. What's actually going to end up happening is you're going to get to the nail phase, things are going a lot faster than you expected, you're pressing all your buttons, you're feeling nervous, you're going to forget something, and then you're going to either get killed by a mechanic or worse, wiping your team. Then you just repeat this process over and over 50 times until through brute force you finally memorize the mechanic, and then you're ready to go on to the next one. This is a long and painstaking process, and it's all because you set yourself up to struggle in the first place. You are not a robot, and you don't have a perfect memory. Something you should be trying to do instead when you're studying or learning a mechanic is trying to turn things that you normally have to memorize into things that you could intuitively solve in a moment. An example from Nail would be the fire and ice mechanic. During this phase, fire tethers spawn on players periodically that turn into a small AoE after a couple seconds, granting people a fire debuff. This is used to cleanse the ice debuff that dragons surrounding the arena give you. The current strategy is all fire AoEs in except for fire 2. Additionally, if you were the person with the fire 2 AoE, you should be out of the fire 3 tether AoE. Sometimes, you miss getting hit by a fire, or the second fire AoE hits the whole group by accident. For players that have committed this order to memory and rely on it, all chaos breaks loose. Does fire 3 now go out? What if you didn't remember that you were the second fire tether and you accidentally step into the third fire tether? You don't have to remember all these permutations. They're good to know, but keep it simple. Getting hit by fire or ice assigns you that respective debuff. All you have to think about is, if I currently have the fire debuff, I do not want to get hit by a fire. If I currently have the ice debuff, I want to get hit by fire. Seriously, it's that simple. The same applies to other debuffs you see in the phase. You don't have to memorize what order Doom Cleanse you are. All you have to remember is that when your Doom timer is low, 5 seconds or less, then I should grab the next Doom puddle. You don't have to memorize exactly when the Thunder debuffs go out. All you have to know is that when your Lightning debuff timer is low, get away from people. Don't rely on your memory. Instead, allow the debuff timer to tell you what to do. Unlike your memory, it will never lie to you. There are mechanics and scenarios where you have no choice but to memorize things, but do your best to try to turn things from memory into instead logic or intuition. If you get good at this, you'll find that memorizing things actually comes more naturally and easier throughout your prog. You don't have to start by memorizing everything. Instead, ask yourself, what is this mechanic doing in the first place? How can I resolve this mechanic? This leads into the next tip. Tip number 2. Don't just learn how to do the mechanic, understand the mechanic. With how many toolboxes, raid plans, videos, simulations, and other resources out there, it's very easy to catch yourself just watching or clicking along and not really understanding some of the finer details of a mechanic. On top of this, it's not common that a POV or guide you watch will include all of the small intricacies of a mechanic. When it comes to raiding in Final Fantasy XIV, your level of success directly correlates to the amount of knowledge you have about mechanics. The more details you know about a mechanic, the harder it is to mess it up. For example, let's say you're a tank and you're close to clearing M4S. You're doing some homework and you're looking up some video guides and POVs on one of the final mechanics in the fight, Sunrise Sabbath. You find out that you get assigned a debuff that's either blue or yellow. When your debuff timer gets low, you go to a cannon of the opposite color to get hit and baited away from other players. You do some further studying and find out that in PF, the way that you get assigned which cannon you go to follows a priority system, where tanks and healers start northwest, then go counterclockwise. Sounds simple enough as a tank. When it's your turn to go and bait a cannon, you look northwest and go counterclockwise to find the first cannon you can resolve. To make sure that you understand, you check out some POVs. In this video guide, I see that I have a blue debuff, so I'm going to be looking for a yellow cannon. Let's look to the west to find our cannon, and yep, found it right there. Guy with the yellow thing, I'm just going to go there and bait the cannon. Just to be sure, I'm going to check out one more POV. I see in my party list that I have a yellow debuff, so I will be looking northwest counter for a blue cannon. I'm looking... Yep, there's a blue guy. I just go and bait it. Very easy. Alright, great. Your turn. You end up getting the Sunrise Sabbath. You see your debuff color. You look over to your side of the arena to find your clone and... Uh-oh. Why are they both blue? Where do I go? In this scenario, you'd actually keep going counterclockwise and end up southeast. However, your small sample size of POVs and guides just happened not to show this example, and you found out that this pattern exists a little bit too late. You don't bait your cannon, and it's a white 10 minutes into the fight. This is not a made-up example. This small technicality tripped up countless amount of players in the first few weeks of this fight. But let's ask ourselves, did you mess this mechanic up because you're a bad player? No, you simply just didn't know. As I mentioned previously, your level of success directly correlates with the amount of knowledge that you have. On the surface level, it's not really that hard to understand mechanics, especially with the amount of resources that there are out there. However, it's not always obvious why things look or are done in the way that they are. In a lot of cases, overlooking a small detail of a mechanic can prove fatal for your party. When you are studying a fight, take the opportunity to try and really understand why you're doing the things that you are, or why you're standing somewhere. Always ask yourself, what is the boss actually doing here? What is my job in this mechanic to resolve it? And what are the different possible ways that I can resolve this mechanic? Let's now talk about tip number 3, and that is understand how your brain works. There's only one of you on this planet, and there's only one type of your brain. Nobody thinks the same way as you. People might have similar hobbies or interests, but no one quite thinks like you do. And the same is true for Final Fantasy XIV rating. There is no one correct answer for how you should resolve a mechanic in your head. Some people learn by repetition in game, others like having a diagram on their second monitor. Some people rely on visual cues. Think about yourself for a moment. Are there particular mechanics that you do quite well in? Are there mechanics that you struggle with? Maybe you excel in downtime puzzle mechanics, where you have to solve something while the boss is untargetable. Maybe you're really good at mechanics where you have to flex for other players. I sent out a survey to players that have a good amount of experience with difficult fights in Final Fantasy XIV. From the 200 plus respondents, we can see that a majority of them have cleared at least one Savage or Ultimate fight. One of the questions was, what's the hardest encounter for you to learn in your rating history? So, not exactly what is the hardest fight in the game, but what fight was hardest for you to learn? Looking at the results, we can see that a couple of different fights were mentioned, with the heavy hitters being Top, DSR, Fru. Not surprising, as they are the most recent Ultimates. Okay, let's take this one step further. What was the hardest mechanic for you to learn? For these results, I won't even show a chart. Instead, here's a list. Of course, by number, there are more mechanics than there are fights, so a longer list makes more sense. But surely there are a couple of extremely difficult mechanics in the game that everybody agrees are hard to learn. Maybe that would be the case if the question was, what is the hardest mechanic in a game, as opposed to, what is the hardest mechanic for you? The truth of the matter is, everybody thinks differently. So, people are going to struggle with different mechanics. If you're ever part of a static, you know this to be true. Something you can do to help yourself tremendously as a raider is to think about how you think. Why is this mechanic not clicking for me? Why am I struggling here? Don't always blame the mechanic and say, this was way too confusing, or there's just way too much to remember, or it's too fast. Take one step further and put yourself in the picture. Why is this difficult for me? What exactly do I have to remember? Is there a way to mentally slow this mechanic down for me? The key difference here is that when you're looking at a problem at the first level, there's nothing you can really do to help yourself. You can't change the game code or the mechanic to make it easier or slower. But when you place yourself in the equation, there are suddenly variables that you have control over and can change. One of my favorite examples from the survey I sent out is about Diamond Dust in the most recent Ultimate Futures Rewritten. Here, Shiva can cast Axe Kick or Scythe Kick, which tells the players if they should be out or if they should be in. Here they are as examples.
Cleave.
Axe out.
Rape.
Scythe in.
For some players, this is just solved by memory. They memorize that Axe equals out and Scythe equals in. But what if your brain doesn't have the best memory? Plus, there are other things going on during the mechanic. You don't want to overload yourself. This player described their approach for how they remember which is which. Quoting from the survey, When Rin uses Axe or Scythe Kick during Diamond Dust, I remember that when she says cleave, it means out, because cleave has leave in it, and that reap means in because reapers are usually in for uptime. It's stupid, but it works every time. Let me play that video where it's the out pattern again. Do you hear the boss saying cleave?
Cleave.
X out.
Now, this is not how I think about the mechanic, and I'm sure that's the case for 99% of other raiders, but this works quite well for them. And if you noticed, this trick that they're using to memorize the mechanic ties into tip number 1. Stop completely relying on your memory. Find out how your brain works, and then try to transform mechanics into a way that you can understand. Not just in the same way that your friend or a guide tells you how to do it. Alright, let's get into the final tip. Tip number 4. Make your mistakes meaningful. Let's face it, no matter how much you study or how prepared you feel when you're coming up to a new mechanic, you're going to die. A lot. It's part of the process. In fact, the survey I mentioned earlier also asked about what helped players finally understand the mechanics that they were progging. Clarity through repetition was a big factor. However, not all time spent is equal. Let's take 2 players as an example, player 1 and player 2. They both spent 2 hours in a lockout, then wait 1 hour in PF, then get into another 2-hour lockout. Player 1 just played the game during their 4 hours and watched YouTube video guides during their 1-hour break. Player 2 instead recorded themselves while playing the game and reviewed their first 2 hours during the break. Overall, both players spent 5 hours engaging with the fight in some shape or form. However, player number 2 on average will see much more success in the long run. Why is that? That's because they are focusing on the most important factor when it comes to becoming a consistent raider: yourself. You can have a perfect understanding of how a mechanic works, but all that knowledge is worthless if you can't execute on it. Final Fantasy XIV raiding isn't the same as a test you take at school, where you study beforehand then show up and fill in some answers. There's a gameplay component to raiding just as much as there is a studying component. Lots of players don't realize exactly what they are doing until they watch themselves back in a replay or VOD. I promise, when you watch yourself in a replay, you're going to catch yourself thinking, why did I do that? Don't be embarrassed or feel silly when you're investigating your own mistakes. Everybody has moments where they wipe the entire raid. Your mission as a consistent raider isn't to eliminate those moments completely, it's to limit them as much as possible. So, what does it mean to make wipes meaningful? It means learning as much as you can about the mechanic and about yourself whenever you have moments where you make a mistake or misunderstand something. Every raider in the game has their own method of self-improvement, so I can't necessarily dictate to you what you have to do. But I could have a suggested flowchart that maybe you want to start off with. First off, record your gameplay. Whether it's a Twitch VOD, OBS, NVIDIA GeForce, you can even have it set up so you can capture the last couple minutes of gameplay whenever you press a button. I have that set up on my keyboard with the home key. Second, when you have downtime, go back and revisit your mistakes. Is there a particular mechanic you're struggling with? What are you doing wrong? After that, make sure you correctly understand how to resolve the mechanic. Follow that up with by telling yourself in the video, what were you supposed to do? Finally, you should ask yourself, when I get to this mechanic again, what can I do to make it easier for myself? This could be something simple, like changing the way that your camera faces before the mechanic begins. Let's wrap this video up with this summary. There's a lot that goes into being a good raider in Final Fantasy XIV, and this video can't possibly touch on everything all at once. But hopefully the 4 tips that I shared will help you become a more consistent raider when it comes to executing mechanics. First off, stop completely relying on your memory. Try to make mechanics more intuitive or logical for yourself instead. The more things that you have to remember, the more things that can go wrong. Second, don't just learn how to do a mechanic. Understand the mechanic. Ask yourself, why is the strat that I'm doing the way it is? What exactly is the boss doing and how am I resolving it? Third, understand how your brain works. Everybody is different. What might work for one person will not necessarily work for you. You have to think about the way that you think and approach mechanics in a way that your brain can understand. Maybe you prefer thinking of mechanics in terms of lines on the floor in the arena, or you rely on sound cues. Last but not least, make your mistakes meaningful. You are going to die a bunch during prog and wipe your team as well. There is no avoiding this. So instead, work to minimize this. Record yourself, ask for advice, or write down moments where you were confused. Then go back and review your mistakes. Don't be satisfied with just identifying your mistakes. Try to really understand why you made them in the first place. Some fights in Final Fantasy XIV may seem intimidating, but I promise you that the hardest part is just to get started. Once you give a fight a shot and start forming good habits like the tips in this video, everything will become easier. The more that you practice and work on your self-improvement skills, the more confident you can feel when you prog different fights. Believe in yourself. That's the end of the video. This is my first ever YouTube video, and while I don't intend on becoming a content creator, I've been enjoying the community of Final Fantasy XIV so much that I wanted to contribute to it a little bit. I do intend on making some videos in the near future that are rating related, so if you're interested, feel free to subscribe. My Discord's in the description if you ever want to reach out and talk to me for any reason, and I don't really have any other social media, so sorry about that. Thank you for watching.